Welcome all to today's webinar titled How to Benchmark Your Hydraulic Solver, presented by Bill Syme and also Greg Collicutt, two of Tuflow's most senior software developers. We have a huge audience today. We've got in the order of 700 people registered. Looks like we actually have 52 countries. Let's bring everyone online. We have two presenters. We have Bill Syme and Greg Collicutt. And to answer the question and answer behind the scenes, I'll be involved there, as well as Phil Ryan and Xuan Gao. So welcome everyone. Look, let's jump straight into it. Bill, I believe you're starting the presentation. So Xuan, Philip and I will be in the background answering question and answer. Please post your questions there and we'll pass over to Bill.
Okay, so how to benchmark your hydraulic solver. Greg and I will present. I'll do the first part. Greg will do the second. So I'm going to effectively touch on why we need to benchmark and what we should benchmark. And then Greg will get into a bit more detail with the how do we actually do it. So why do we need to benchmark hydraulic solvers? Well, the first thing to appreciate is the modeling that we do really is all about informing decision makers. As modelers, we rarely make those high-level decisions. We're just feeding information to decision makers. And the sort of things we would feed through are like the risk metrics, such as flood hazard, the risk to people, the risk to infrastructure, the flood risk, for example, to the economy as a whole. So we can do all those, come up with those numbers. So also, a very important part is us helping inform them as to the consequences of a measure, such as anything from a levy bank to house raising to improve community awareness. How does that reduce the risk? So that's a lot of what we do in the flood world. When it comes to future planning, what are the impacts of a proposed development, for example? What are the impacts of doing this or doing that? So that feeds into a lot of what we do and then pass on. During an event, such as a flood event, may be called upon to help the emergency management teams be more informed about what's going to happen. The other aspect, of course, is what we come up with can have quite a substantial impact on the actual costs, particularly of infrastructure. So we really want to be confident about our modelling, because if you get that modelling badly wrong, that can have a big impact on the actual cost of reducing the flood risk. But one thing I would really like to highlight too, if you do some benchmarking, even if it's not to the detail that we do here in Tuflow, you'll become a much better, more confident modeler. I've seen this over and over again in my career. Once people have, for example, have joined us and they do a lot of testing and benchmarking and what ifs, and they get into the detail, they go out as a much more confident modeler. They're much more knowledgeable, much more easier to pass on the understandings of our modeling to others. It will also improve your workflow efficiency quite enormously, because you are that more confident modeler. You can make sound decisions earlier on rather than sort of guessing. And you'll find that you will enjoy your modeling a lot more. But of course, ultimately, particularly in the flood modeling world, and modeling accuracy does have a direct impact on people's lives. So that feeds into everything in many ways. So what we come up with will have a direct impact on people's lives in the future and where people live and build and so forth. That's what we do at the top end. But the reason we really need to benchmark is there are actually uncertainties everywhere in our modeling. So the input data, that's always never going to be precise. The parameters that we specify, such as Manning's-N, we have some good indicative ranges of the values we should use. So we should be inside those ranges, but they're not precise values. Our boundaries can often be quite a large source of uncertainty, particularly flow boundaries. Water level boundaries, if they're recorded or well-defined, are less uncertain. Rainfall, we only have the rainfall that occurs in a flood at a few locations sometimes, or not at all. So our interpretation of that rainfall or extrapolation builds uncertainty. Your model setup. So while none of us will produce the perfect model. So how we do that, how we go about it, the cell sizes we choose, etc., will affect the uncertainty in the modeling. And then, of course, you have the computations. Effectively, what you need to understand is no solution is exact. And so we can minimize a lot of those uncertainties through benchmarking, particularly when it comes to your solver computations and insensitivity testing parameters and so forth. So no model is 100% right. So you need to understand, is your numerical solution appropriate or not? And the first thing to appreciate is that solver solutions are effectively just a stripped down version of the full fluid flow equations. You're never really working with the complete, perfect equation. And so you need to know whether you are actually modeling the physics that you are trying to reproduce. As a modeler, that's really, really important. Then you also need to know, does the solution have any dependencies? Do the results change due to changes in the model's cell sizes, excuse me, cell shapes, cell orientations, time stepping? And that's why it's very pleasing to see that poll results, so people are doing this, which is excellent. And then it comes to, you might have the perfect numerical solution. Well, you'll never have the perfect, but you have a good numerical solution, hopefully, for what you need to do. And then it comes into the business of, is the model reproducing reality? And about the only way we can really ascertain that is through calibration. Now, not all models can be calibrated, but if you are lucky enough to be able to calibrate, if you've got good data, your calibration will struggle if your solution is not appropriate or has dependencies. And I'll just, not a topic of this webinar, but I really will emphasize that the garbage in, garbage out message, that just flows through everything we do. If you don't have a calibrated model, you're working with an uncalibrated model, you can't calibrate it, you still are reliant. In fact, you are more reliant on working with an appropriate numerical solution. And of course, you always will be reliant on having good data going in to produce reliable answers. Today's webinar is all about the top part there, the numerical solution. So what should we benchmark? What are some of the primary things that we should be benchmarking? Well, the first thing to understand is that the fluid flow equations, they actually come in quite a lot of different formations. So there's the spatial dimension, you have 1D solutions, 2D, 3D layered. And then those equations are stripped down and come in different forms. So the simplest it will probably come across is a kinematic wave, which is simply just the bed resistance equation. Then you move on to diffusive wave, which adds gravity to the kinematic wave. Then you get into the dynamic wave, and there's quite a few variations there. So if you don't have turbulence, dynamic wave, you're effectively adding inertia. Some will not have turbulence represented. So that's more suited to low energy hydraulics. If you move into flood hydraulics, you really need to have that turbulence term added and well represented. Then if you move into coastal hydraulics, you actually need more terms again for some of your studies, such as the pressure and Coriolis forces. And if you're into CFD, of course, you're into a higher level again. So the equations do come in quite a lot of different forms. Then you have how you solve that equation. There's three primary ones that have been in use within the industry over quite a long time now, and that's finite element, which is probably the original one, finite difference, and finite volume, which tends to prevail today. And then how you solve those equations in space and time is also driven by how the level of numerical order that you're working with. So just to try and sort of graphically illustrate what I'm saying here is, if you're trying to model that picture on the right there, so the flows are moving slowly, you can ride a bike through them, it's not particularly rapid movement. We call that low energy flows. So your kinematic energy, your V squared on 2G, is very small or zero. And in those areas, you'll have subcritical flow, things like inertia and turbulence are really not important. The velocities are just too small to make those terms influential. So the equations or the flow is typically what we call storage dominated. And the very nice, simple mass balance equation tends to rule. You just got to make sure you're not losing mass or gaining mass. But not very far away from where that photo is taken, this was the flow in the main channel. And that is what we call high energy flow. So this is getting to the extreme end where you've actually got a hydraulic jump that's formed within the channel. So you're talking about very fast moving water. You've got a combination of super and subcritical flows. This is what we call conveyance dominated flows, where the momentum equation rules. So just to jump in a bit on the terms, effectively on the top right photo, we can ignore inertia and turbulence and any other forces. So we have a much simpler equation to solve, and that's what we call the diffusive wave solution. But if you have something down the bottom right, that image there, you really need to have all those terms, and the diffusive wave solution is completely inappropriate. So you do need that full dynamic solution. So as modelers, we really do have to understand and appreciate what physical terms are important for our modeling. One of the most challenging parts of our modeling is effectively related to energy dissipation. That occurs primarily as energy being dissipated as heat as it moves along. And that happens through effectively a friction against the surface, the bed. And by and large, the industry just focuses on using Manning's equation to represent that resistive force. No questions asked there. But the other way that energy is dissipated is through the diffusion of momentum or turbulence. And that occurs very strongly where you have a sharp bend or a rock ledge underneath the water, where you have constrictions, such as in that little video, the flows come in through the bridge and expanding. So you're getting a lot of energy loss through that type of structure. So importantly, what we as modelers need to appreciate is 1D can't model turbulence. It's just too simple to do it. So what we do is we apply energy loss coefficients at structures and bends to compensate for that. And that's been done for many years with great success. The 2D is a bit more difficult because it does depend on the solver. So if you're just got a pseudo 2D, as I call it, where you're just solving the 1D equations over a 2D mesh, that will be completely inappropriate for that image on the right there, that video. Then you might not have turbulence built in, so that might be okay in some situations, but not really for the situation on the right. Then we have first order spatial, and that's typically will be numerically diffusive. So it actually, this numerical solution imparts a diffusivity to the results, which almost acts like a sort of eddy viscosity, but it's completely inappropriate or wrong. Then you go to second order spatial, which is tends to be very little numerical diffusion, and you don't really need to go to third order because the numerical diffusion is generally very close to zero with a good scheme. So that's where you want to be for solving that on the right. So 2D may not model all the turbulence. That's the only thing you need to keep in the back of your mind is if there's vertical circulations, there's helicoidal circulations around a sharp bend, or the subgrid obstructions, if you've got a pair inside an element, there will be energy losses at that subgrid that you need to add to your 2D model. But that's another whole topic. Okay, so I'll finish off with just demonstrating some solution dependencies. So cell size, shape, and orientation can all affect your results. Whether you're fixed grid or flexible mesh, they can all have a strong influence on your results. Time stepping, does that actually affect your results? If you halve your time step, what happens? Numerical solution, what happens if we change from first order to second order? So if you're unsure about a lot of this, what do? Well, we simply sensitivity test. And Greg will go into a lot more detail on that. But I've got one little example here, which is quite nice. And so this is showing the rise and fall. The black line here is the measured values. This is from a very, very well calibrated study of the Brisbane River where there's excellent data, very, very small GIGO, garbage in, very little garbage going in, which is excellent to work with. So what we're seeing here is the results from a first order solution for different cell sizes. So 60 meters, 50, 40, down to 20 meters. So you can see there that the results from those different simulations are quite different, that there's no, you haven't really converged on a solution yet. You're heading actually to the right direction, but we need to keep making that cell size smaller and smaller, which may become unmanageable. So we have what we call poor cell size convergence. So if you move to a second order solution, nothing else is different. You're seeing the results converge much more nicely. The 60 meters sort of stands out a bit, but you probably get an okay result with any of the other resolutions. So what that's telling you is that you probably work with anything from 50 meters downwards in a second order solution. And importantly, you're getting some sort of convergence. So that means that you can be, you can probably be reasonably confident you don't have to go down to a 20-meter model. You can work with a 30 or 40-meter model. So we've improved things there by just simply going from a first order to second order. If you add in the feature what we call subgrid sampling, where each cell actually is sampling the underlying terrain data at much higher accuracy. So you're working with effectively cross sections on your cell faces and a storage area curve for your volume. You'll see the convergence improve even more. So in this case, we're seeing excellent convergence. And that means that you can literally run that model at 60 meters and get very consistent results with your finer grids, which can improve your run times enormously. So in terms of time stepping is the other one. So I'll just whiz through these. Greg will explain a bit more. But generally, time step, if it does, it might be a characteristic of the solution, but it's very easy to test. You just halve your time stepping, compare your results, and on the right there, you can see this is the results from doing that, and they're exactly identical, exactly on top of each other, which is what you really want to see with time stepping. But if there's a divergence, you need to explore that further. You might just have to keep reducing your time step. The one other time that this might be needed is if you do have some bounces or instabilities in your model that you haven't noticed or seen, or they're very discrete, that might help. This halving the time step will certainly might help with that. So in summary, these are the types of things that you really want to be benchmarking for. And I won't go through these now. Greg will work through these. But they're the types of things that we really want to be working with in terms of benchmarking and so forth. So I'm going to hand it over to Greg now to dive in a bit more detail.
Thank you for that, Bill. That was really good. So Bill's talked about why we need to do benchmarking and what sort of things that we need to benchmark. I'm going to delve down into a little bit more detail about how you can do this benchmarking work. We've talked about, Bill pointed out how beneficial it is for you as modelers to be able to do some of this benchmarking yourself. Ultimately, it will make you a better modeler and help you to execute projects with a better profit margin and better quality answers at the end of the day. So let's go through some cases now for how we're going to do benchmark these different features. So bed friction. All modeling software, 1D, 2D, 3D, they need to be able to reproduce bed friction. This is an absolute given. How do you test this? In this case, the tests are actually fairly simple. You need to know whether your solver is using Manning's equation or Chesy or a KS log law roughness model. You need to know what sort of bed friction you've selected in the model. But just create a very simple model of a uniform rectangular channel that's on a slope, put a certain amount of flow in at one end, and put a downstream boundary condition at the other end, either just a fixed water level boundary condition or actually a stage discharge relationship. And then you have a look at what sort of results that you get from that, and you can compare the depth results for this channel against an actual spreadsheet calculation. It's very simple. You don't need to go off and read a scientific paper on it in order to know how to do it. But just some things to bear in mind when you do this particular test. You need to know whether you're reproducing Manning's equation or Chesy or KS roughness. you need to know whether your solver is using resistance radius or hydraulic radius. And that will, to some extent, depend on whether or not you're doing it as a 1D channel or as a 2D model. If it's in 2D, chances are you're just using resistance radius, which is the depth. If you're doing it as a 1D model, then you'd probably be using hydraulic radius, which is area over perimeter, or at least the solver might give you the option to choose. Do the test to start with a subcritical flow and make sure you get the right result. And then just for out of interest, try it with a supercritical flow and see how well the solver copes with that. And then if you're doing this test in 2 dimensions with a 2D solver, you need to think about particularly things like if you're doing a fixed grid mesh, it's one thing if your channel and flow is perfectly aligned with the mesh, but what happens if your flow direction is not aligned with the mesh? Does your solver still get it right? And particularly if it's not aligned with the mesh, how then does element size matter if you've got actually a finite width channel? So we'll look at some of these cases on the next slide. So here we've got the very first case that I talked about is just a simple parallel flow case where the flow is aligned with the 2D solver. Now, this is because all of the, in this particular webinar, all of the results that we're presenting are from 2Flow HPC, which is a fixed grid solver. There are plenty of other softwares out there. Some of them have flexible meshes, some of them don't. If you want to know how well your solver performs for these cases, we're not going to tell you that. We're going to leave that for you to do as your own homework to see if you can reproduce some of these cases for yourselves and understand your own solver as to whether or not it gets the answers that you were expecting. So in this particular case, you can see in the figure in the bottom left corner, we've got a water surface and also an energy level and dashed lines. The blue lines are the results out of the software, and the red lines are the results that you would expect from a hand calculation, and they agree very well. We then went on and thought, that's all good. They agree well. We went on and thought, well, what happens if you rotate the channel around to a 15-degree channel? And this was a few years ago now that we did this with 2Flow HPC, and all of a sudden we got these results that we weren't quite expecting. The flow vectors down the channel were quite wiggly because of the staircases in the side, and the depth of water predicted in the channel was more than what Manning's equation said it should be. So that was not a pleasant result to get. And in fact, at 30 degrees, the problem became even worse. At 45 degrees, it actually was a little bit better than it was at 30 degrees, but it still wasn't correct. And that's what caused us to really go back to the drawing board and think about how the cells that are on the boundary between wet and dry, they obviously play a very important role in the solution. And that's a huge part or factor of how we came up with the subgrid sampling for SGS. So with SGS turned on in HPC, now again, this is the 0-degree case, so we got that one right. Then we found the 15-degree case actually came out nicely. The velocity vectors were nice and straight, and it aligned with the numerical calculation. Likewise for 30 degrees, and likewise for 45 degrees. So that's what your solver should be able to reproduce. Obviously, if you're running a flexible mesh solution where you can guide the mesh to follow the flow path, then this sort of problem won't be an issue. But sometimes the flow path is not well defined ahead of time, and you don't know how to design the mesh to match the flow path. So that's a situation where fixed grid just makes life easy for you because you just slap a grid on it and you get an answer. You don't have to design a mesh. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about now is mass balance. You've got to make sure that you're not losing water out of the model. If you're pouring a certain amount of water in at one upstream boundary or as rainfall from the sky, and your solver is losing that water numerically, just disappearing from the model, then no surprise, your water level results will not be right. So you've got to make sure that you've got correct volume conservation, or also known as mass balance. So again, you just create a simple test model that's just got one inlet, one outlet. If your solver is going straight for a steady state solution, then all you need to think about is my outflow rate predicted equal to my inflow rate? They should match. They should match within 1 to 2%. If they're 10% wrong, you've got a serious issue going on. If your solver is a transient solver, then in the process of reaching a steady state, you can actually check for mass balance at any intermediate time between initial and final, just by looking at, the total amount of water that's come out plus what's in the model has to be equal to what you've put into the model plus what was in the model to start with. And so you can do a time by time analysis as well. Again, and you can do this in a spreadsheet to see how well they match up. Now, some solvers use an implicit scheme and some solvers use an explicit scheme. An implicit scheme, and possibly those also with the finites different spatial gradient calculations as well, they can come up with small amount of volume conservation error or mass balance error just by the nature of the scheme. And that's a bit hard to avoid. But again, you need to make sure that the solver settings are adjusted so that at least you've got 99% of the water is tracked and accounted for. You don't want to be losing 10% of it. If your solver is an explicit finite volume solver, then it really has got no excuse. The volume error should be very, very small, very close to zero. So, again, if you've got 98%, then that's probably not what you want. You'd want to be hit for, particularly for a finite volume solution, you should be 99.9% conserving. And just as a word of note here, I did try one solver once. I'm not going to drop any names, but I found that for the particular solution scheme I was trying, that you could run the model with a huge range of time steps, ranging from very fine up to very, very coarse or very large time steps. And the model would give you a solution at a very large time step without producing an error or even producing any warnings. And yet the solution was just wrong. So yeah, that's something to think about during the whole benchmark process. If ever you run a model and you get a result with no warnings and no errors, and the result is terribly wrong, then that should be raising a red flag in your mind as a danger point for the future that you need to make a note of and keep that in mind when you actually do it for real world models. Okay, now in terms of benchmarking inertia terms, these are not easily done with just a simple 1D channel or a 2D pseudo channel. They can be done, but you really need to have a non-uniform flow velocity in the model. So, yep, that and hydraulic jumps will do it. If you've got a model that actually creates a hydraulic jump somewhere, you're not going to get that hydraulic jump, or if you do get it, its location will be questionable if you've got a solution scheme that doesn't account for the inertia terms. And likewise, if you've got a very tight bend with the water flowing around a bend, you would expect super elevation in the real world, that the water level around the outside of the bend will be higher than on the inside. And so, if your solver doesn't include the inertia terms, then you won't get that super elevation. And again, you've got to also think about if your software that you're using offers different solution schemes or different settings or parameters for those schemes, element size and time step, and also the Eddy viscosity model can end up influencing the results for this particular test as well. So those are things to keep in mind. In this case, I'm going to point you towards the Environment Agency in the UK. They offer a 1D benchmarking suite that you can download and run tests for. And you can actually use a 1D benchmarking suite in a 2D solver just by creating a model that's, in this case, you can see it in the middle picture down the bottom of my plot there. Get my mouse up on the screen there. You can see in here I've got what is effectively a 1D model, but I've just run it in 2D by extruding the DEM in the other transverse direction, and it's 10 cells wide. The equation on the left tells you that for a steady state solution, you can substitute, if you know what your flow rate is, then you can work out your velocity as flow rate divided by the water depth and channel width. And then you plug that into your volume conservation equation and your inertia equations, and you combine it all together. And if you can remember how to do some year 12 maths or some first year uni maths, you can end up with that equation that's on the left-hand side there. And that will tell you a numerical solution for how the depth of the water in the channel will vary with spatial position along the channel. And so we've run this with 2-flow HPC for test A part 4, which is a subcritical to supercritical to subcritical flow. The flow is coming from the right to the left. The black line on that chart there is the actual bed level in the model. The green dots are the numerical solution for a given downstream boundary condition, and you can see it transitions through a hydraulic jump there at around about 33 to 34 meters chainage. And then it's supercritical in this region in the middle of the plot, and then upstream it's subcritical again. The transition from subcritical to supercritical doesn't actually create any sort of a jump. It just looks perfectly smooth. It's when you go from supercritical back to subcritical again that you'll get the hydraulic jump. You can see the agreement here is excellent. The other thing that you can see is that the blue line, the blue solution through here, through the hydraulic jump, doesn't match the numerical one exactly, and that is in part due to some numerical dispersion that happens with the total variation diminishing scheme, as well as the Eddy viscosity model will cause a little bit of blurring of the hydraulic jump as well. So, you've got to take that you're not going to nail it absolutely perfectly, but at least the position and of this jump and the water levels upstream and downstream are well reproduced. And this is proof that the solution scheme is conserving or conservative, and also shock capturing as well. The other benchmark case that you can use for figuring out whether or not your solver uses the inertia terms is to look at super elevation. So this is a model that was set up by H. de Vrend, working at the Delft University of Technology. It's quite an old test case now, from back in about 1978, 1979. That's the front page of the report there. You can go to the Delft University website and you can find this report and download it and set up your model accordingly. So the water flows in this rectangular channel around a 180-degree bend. There were a whole lot of measuring stations or cross sections set up around this channel, and they actually looked at secondary flows in this model as well. It was quite a comprehensive test, but we're primarily interested in just being able to predict the water levels around the outer bank and the inner bank. And what you can see in this chart here is that as you work from upstream on the right to downstream on the left, the center line of the channel, the water level, is pretty much a straight line heading downhill. But the inner bank shows a depression around the 180-degree stations for the bend, and the outer bank shows super elevation as well. So we want to see whether or not the software is going to be able to reproduce that. Now, we also ran it with 2-flow HPC, and the first result I'm going to show you, well, in fact, you can see already the water level on the left here has got lots of uneven shading around the outside and inner bank. This is because the model was run without the subgrid sampling feature, and you get these velocity vectors around the edges of the model that wiggle because of, the staircase walls. And in fact, the result is 100% pure terrible. It's not good at all. And again, this was motivation to move on to developing the subgrid sampling methodology and capability. So the next result I'm going to show you is with subgrid sampling turned on. And you can see here now that the shading for the water elevation is nice and smooth. It doesn't have the echoes and ripples coming off the steps in the wall. The flow vectors around the wall are nice and smooth. They're not wiggly. And we get these partially wet indicated cells where the line of the wall is. And we also reproduce the inner bank and outer bank water levels around that as well. So again, that is proof that the equation scheme is in fact doing the right thing with the inertia terms in this model. So these are two test cases that you can download and use to check your solver to see whether or not it can cope with it. Okay, moving on to turbulence. Turbulence also needs to be benchmarked. It is a difficult one to benchmark. It's important. Turbulence is important. I've drawn a diagram here on the left here showing how, as flood modelers, usually what we're most interested in is water elevation. That's the thing you see, as well as that's the thing that actually wets the floorboards of your house or makes your car float away, is the water elevation. But the water elevation controls the velocity field. The velocity field determines the turbulence. The turbulence determines the momentum diffusion, which then changes the velocity field, which then interacts with the surface elevation. The two are connected. Where the rubber meets the road for this wheel is at the bottom, turbulence. It's really important to get that right, where you've got higher energy flows. For more simple flooding with lower energies, the turbulence model is definitely of lesser importance, and I'd say could even be neglected. But when you've got higher energy flows, and this particularly happens when you're resolving a primary flow path as part of your 2D grid, you really want to include a turbulence model with that. So I'm going to show you two test cases that you can use for turbulence. We've got energy loss around a right-angled channel bend, and then we've got velocity pattern downstream of a river groin. And again, this has to be done in a 2D model. You can't do it in 1D. Things to think about before you start your benchmarking is your results are going to be cell size sensitive, and you need to know whether or not your solver is using first or second order spatial interpolation, because that will change the results a lot as well. So just quickly, the right-angled bend case. So here's the text on the right this was done by the Kansas Department of Transport by T. Malone. Yeah, they set up a right-angle bend in a laboratory flume, poured water around it, and measured the height loss around the bend. And they plotted that as a function of the velocity head for a whole lot of different flow cases and for different bend angles. They did it for 30 degrees up to 90 degrees. Importantly, for 90 degrees here, these are all the black squares and this line at the top, the steepest line on the chart. Again, the bend loss appears to be fairly linear with velocity head, indicating that the losses are just a simple loss coefficient relationship around the bend, and the slope of that line is 1.23. So that's the sort of loss coefficient that we're wanting to get. So what I've done is I've set that up in two-flow HPC. I've determined the loss factor around the bend, and I've run that model for 2 cells across the channel, 3 cells, 4 cells. I did 6 cells, 8, 9, or 11 and 16 cells, all the way up to 32 cells. And we had a look at the predicted loss factor as a function of those number of cells. So this is a cell size convergency test. If we used a constant turbulence model, you could get convergence in terms of the result asymptotes to something as you refine the model, and you could adjust the constant model coefficient to get it to converge to something that would have been in those dotted lines. So if you used about 0.004 constant viscosity, kinematic viscosity, then you would have landed in the dashed lines there. And that's true also of the Weir 2D turbulence model, the Weir 3D component, and the Prandtl turbulence model. They all work, they all converge, and they can be adjusted to get the right result. But very interestingly, the Smagorinsky turbulence model, this one always converges to the no viscosity result. As you refine the model smaller and smaller and smaller, it ends up converging to no viscosity. And that's because the Smagorinsky model, the turbulent kinetic viscosity, or the kinematic turbulent viscosity, is proportional to cell area times the magnitude of the gradient of the velocity tensor. And the cell area, of course, is going to zero as you refine the mesh. So the model actually fails. It becomes an LES model, which just doesn't work in 2D. The other test case you can look at is the water flow downstream of a river groin. So again, here's the reference. You can look this one up and download it and attempt to reproduce the results for yourself. So this is a 2D channel, and we've got flow coming from left to right. There is a groin that protrudes out into the channel, and then you look at velocity transects downstream of that groin at short distance and then progressively increasing distances downstream. And as you work your way downstream, the velocity transect will eventually recover back to uniform flow. But how quickly does it recover? In here, you're going to get a recirculation eddy behind the groin, and then eventually well downstream is going to recover. So we've run this one with two-flow HPC as well. And these charts here are showing the velocity along the x-axis or the abscissor axis, and then the distance from the near bank out into the channel is on the vertical axis. We've run it for a range of different WU models using the CD3, the 3D coefficient. And for these different transects, this is the one x on b equals 2 is the one that's closest to the groin, and then the right-hand one at the other end is the one that's well downstream. You can see that the velocity field does begin to recover as you move your way downstream. You get the best results with a 3D coefficient of around about 1 or so. So this is another test case that you can use to try and benchmark your eddy viscosity model. And that moves me on to spatial interpolation. You want to look at whether your solver is using 1D or, first order or second order spatial interpolation. Again, you need a test case with a non-uniform velocity field. And if you've got first order interpolation, then you'll expect a linear convergence to your zero error result. And if you've got second order interpolation, you'll expect to see a quadratic convergence. And this is where there's an interesting interplay here as well, in that if you've got a good second order spatial interpolation, then it has almost zero numerical diffusion. And what that means is that if you turn off your eddy viscosity model or throw it out, then you end up with completely chaotic solutions of swirls and eddies that look absolutely beautiful, but effectively, they are 2D large eddy simulations. The results of those you need to be treated with caution. They are quite possibly incorrect. Even if you run the model for a long time and time averages the results, they still may not be right. So treat those with care. So we're going to look at the test case again. Bill presented a couple of charts from this earlier on from the Brisbane River, except this time we're not running the transient model. We'll just run it as a steady state solution. Well, we run it in transient mode until it gets to steady state. And what's really important with this thing about the first order spatial interpolation is that it applies to 1D solvers, it applies to 2D flexible mesh solvers, it applies to 2D fixed grid solvers, it applies to any 3D solver, including CFD. This is absolutely fundamental with any sort of a spatial discretization scheme as to whether or not it's first or second order. So what I've done is here goes long profiles of the water level down the river from the upstream boundary at the left down to the downstream boundary, which was a fixed water level at the right-hand end. And what you can see here is the left chart, we've got different colors for different cell sizes, 50, 40, 30, 20, and then down to 10 meters. The first order result is showing a strong cell size sensitivity. And in fact, the range of that's over a meter difference in water level, depending upon cell resolution at the upstream boundary. Very strong effect. On the right-hand chart, we've got the second order scheme. You can see the differences in the results are much, much less. There are still some differences in the results. We can actually plot the upstream water level as a function of cell size. And when we do that, we get this blue curve and the orange curve there, the upstream water level as a function of cell size. Looking at that, you can kind of hazard a guess that it looks like if we were to continue running the model at finer and finer meshes, that we would end up with a result of probably 5.05 meters at a 0 cell size. That's what you would call your fully converged result. In which case now, we can think of the vertical axis here as being the error term, the difference between what we got and what would be the correct answer. What you can see here is the blue line. It's looking reasonably linear, but it's rolling off a little bit. And that's because the water level's actually breaking out onto the floodplains once you get these higher water elevations. So it's not giving us quite a linear response. You probably can play around with other test cases and get a linear response if you get the right test case. Whereas the second order result here, this orange curve, you can see that that actually looks like the bottom part of a parabola. It looks quadratic. And that's because with second order spatial interpolation, the error term is quadratic with regard to cell size. With first order, it's linear. So this is a test that you can use to determine for yourself, if you don't already know, or if you don't trust the documentation. You can, I'm not suggesting anyone not to trust the documentation, sorry. You can determine for yourself whether your solution scheme is using a first order or a second order scheme. And just keep in mind that in this particular case, this was a high energy flow in a fairly constrained river with a lot of tight meandering bends. This is a challenging case for resolving the flow field in 2D. The first order losses are just, in this particular case, are just so large that you probably would not want to run this model with eddy viscosity. And in fact, even then, if you wanted to match calibration data, you might find yourself tempted to run with 0 Manning's number or something that's just unrealistically low. So these should be flagging, you know, your red flashing lights in your head that there's something wrong with my model. If I have to throw out eddy viscosity and run it with a 0 Manning's number or a crazy low Manning's number in order to get calibration. So that's when you should be looking and asking for a second order solution. Just a couple last slides very quickly. 2D models will also need some structures. Well, in fact, you can have structures in a 1D model as well. You need to represent things like weirs and bridges with some sort of energy loss model to account for the loss of head across the structure. And there are standard flow equations for those. There's a Weir flow equation. There's also energy loss coefficients for bridges that you can look up in literature as well. So it is a good idea to set up a quick benchmark case with your solution scheme to test the structures to make sure the structures are actually doing what you think the structure should do. Here goes a test case. I don't have time to do the bridge one, but this is a Weir flow case. So this is your standard Weir equation up on the top here, your Q equals equation. And then you can also include a submergence factor, C sub SF, which is for the case when the downstream water level gets above the top of the Weir. So this is the Villemont submergence factor, and there are published coefficients for A and B here. And you can set up a test case where you can predict what the upstream water level, which is the dashed red line, what the upstream water level should be as a function of Weir height for a given flow condition. In this particular plot, you might have to look at this plot on a second viewing of the webinar to really figure it out. It's a bit hard to understand, but the left-hand side of this plot, the Weir is acting as a Weir, very much a upstream controlled flow case, and the downstream end, the right-hand end of the plot, the Weir is acting as a shallow water equation model where the Weir is almost have 0 influence in the model, and it needs to transition from one to the other. with two-flow HPC, we are able to implement 2D Weir structures in 2D. And of course, you have to be able to make these work for arbitrary mesh alignments with regard to the flow path. So we've tested it for 0 degrees, 15 degrees, 30 degrees, and 45 degrees. And we've done it for thin weirs and thick weirs. And the end result here is these dots, which are just so on top of each other that you can't actually see the symbols underneath, but they are all there. We get an excellent agreement there for the structure performance. And I have to credit Xuan Gao for that. Big shout out to him with his coding to get that right. That was a fantastic piece of work. Okay, I am done. On this last slide here, look, we've got this is a list of, we love producing these webinars to explain everything that we've learned over the years of developing two-flow and making it better and better year on year. We've put our knowledge into all of these webinars that you guys can jump online and you can look at whenever you want. So they're a great reference to come back to. And if I can just say, and as a quick summary, look, accuracy is important. No model is 100% accurate, but just because you can't get it perfect doesn't mean that you should accept something that's sloppy or wrong. You shouldn't. You need to get it as good as you reasonably can. Accuracy is important. People's lives depend on it. Your business profits depend on it, and your career depends on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg, and also Bill. I'm not sure if you can see all the praise that's flowing there, Greg and Bill, but lots of thumbs up, hearts, claps. Thank you very much for the presentation. Okay, I'll start with a curly one. Shouldn't the task of benchmarking be the task of a software provider, not the modeler? What do you say to that?
Put up a bit. I saw your answer, Chris, to that, and I put up a bit of reply. Yeah, absolutely. The software provider has to do, by and large, the bulk of the benchmarking, particularly on the numerical solution, because the software provider has the power to manipulate, or manipulate maybe the wrong word, but to improve that numerical solution if they're finding a problem. We've done that so many times with two-flow. A number of times we've scratched our heads and said, oh, we really need to make this better. But we have the power to do that. But when it comes to some of the dependencies, such as cell size and time stepping, they can be more model specific. It can be both numerical solution, a characteristic of the numerical solution, and if the software provider is not providing any guidance on that, it's really worthwhile focusing on some of those potential dependencies. And we don't mean you do this for every single simulation. You're just basically doing a modeling exercise at some point. Once the model's sort of up and running, you get a feel if there's any dependencies through some pretty straightforward sensitivity tests, as we've been explaining. And that will improve your confidence enormously. So look, yeah, software providers have to do the bulk, but as modelers, we have a responsibility to be confident about our models as well.
Mm-hmm. I've got a comment here, actually, from one of the FE developers. There was a comment made during the Inertia term slide with the U-bend channel, just about the water levels at the outside of the bend, sort of questioning why the levels didn't get high enough. It turns out there's actually a 3D version of that same model that matches really nicely. So just a bit of a clarification on what was said during the presentation there. Another question, when you do testing, how do you convey uncertainties inherent in our flood modeling results, particularly to decision makers? So how do we make it so that we can communicate that information to them easily?
Just through sensitivity tests, run your, plus, for example, Manning's N. How sensitive is your Manning's Ns? And you'll find that the Manning's N will be most sensitive in the high velocity area. So you can increase the Manning's N on your floodplain as much as you like, but you may not get much change in results. Whereas in the river, if you increase or change your Manning's N, it'll be very, very sensitive. So you just increase it up or down plus or minus 10%, particularly the primary flow path in the case of Manning's. See what the change in results are. And then that gives some feel, you get a feel as to whether that's important or not important. So so then when you're talking with the decision makers, you can, they may say, well, can't we just smooth up or do this or do that. And then if you've done that sensitivity testing, you can provide guidance on that. And same for all the other, like cell size is one that decision makers aren't necessarily wanting to know about, but they rely on the modeler to do good modeling. But as a modeler, you need to be confident that if the decision maker comes back to you and says, can you please put this road in here, and you need to go to a finer mesh to model that road, you need to know as a modeler that changing that mesh is not going to upset your base case, because there's nothing worse than going back to a decision maker saying, well, actually our base case results have all changed. That goes down like a lead balloon. So it's really important to have your setting up your model, you are very, very confident about that it can be used for continual what if scenarios. It can handle mesh changes, it can handle whatever. So yeah.
Very good. One here for Greg, actually. So different solution schemes have different time stepping approaches, and TwoFlow HPC in particular uses the self-calculating adaptive time step. So it should be choosing a time step that is appropriate. Using that scheme, is it still crucial to do your time step testing, or can you ignore that step?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That is a very good question. TwoFlow HPC uses the fourth order Runge-Kutta time step integrator, which is historically proven to be exceptionally accurate and stable, provided you meet the physical time step requirements. And now HPC automatically computes its own time step in order to keep meeting those requirements all the way through the simulation. And with the fourth order result, what you do tend to find is that provided the model ran stably, the result is almost certainly rock solid right. Very occasionally, you might see a little glitch or a bounce in a solution that won't show up if you run it with a smaller time step. But HPC is extremely insensitive to adjustments in time step or deliberately forcing it to run with a smaller time step. So in this webinar, we didn't present any of those results, but that is not true of other software. I have seen other software that is extremely sensitive in the results to time step. So that's why, although we haven't stressed it in this webinar, if you're not using TwoFlow HPC, I do strongly recommend that you check your results against time step to make sure that you don't have a nasty surprise there.
Bill, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I put a little reply out, which is in line with Greg's, which is good.
Okay.
I think the only thing I would say is certainly the older implicit schemes like TwoFlow Classic can be quite time step sensitive if you start going to large current numbers. They can run a much bigger time steps, but if you go too big a time step, you start getting ridiculous results. So that's the whole business about just making sure that setting is not dependent, doesn't affect your results if you change it.
Stretching my memory of the manual, but I think in there it says something like it can run up to a value of current number of say 7.
Yeah, so for most
it'll still run larger than that, but it'll actually cause grief.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to dive into my masters back in '89, there's some nice examples in there where if you go to ridiculously high time steps, the flow patterns are just nonsense. So it's stable, but the flow patterns are nonsense. So that's like running current numbers of 15, 20, 30.
I might just ask one last question, and then we'll save the rest for the written answers. There's one that hasn't been upvoted because it was just added. But I think it's a valid question that probably takes priority over the others. Would the same solver result in different benchmarking results depending on the software that is used for the simulation? So to flesh that out a bit, if product X says it solves the shallow water equations using a second order scheme and software Y says the same thing, should they get the same answer? Or...
Well, you probably find unless they've got exactly the same almost code in terms of solving it, using exactly the same approaches, they will probably give different answers because it's ultimately is how you're numerically solving it. And you do see some quite strong similarities between software that are similar. I mean, years ago now, but I did quite a lot of benchmarking between Mike 21 and TwoFlow Classic, which are both similar sort of schemes. And by and large, you'll get quite similar answers in a lot of the situations. But if you move to finite volume, that'll change things a bit. Greg, do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, look, because there's no such thing also as a pure second order scheme. Any software that claims to be implementing a second order scheme will be actually unwinding that back to a first order scheme in regions where you get very complex flow patterns that have got sharp shocks or gradients in them. And exactly how they do that unwinding is also up for grabs, and different coders will implement it different ways. So yeah, you would expect that a explicit finite volume scheme with a second order spatial interpolation by software vendor A and claiming the same thing from software vendor B, they should be pretty similar in their results, but they'll never be identical. There'll probably be a few surprises here and there.
Okay, look, let's leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you presenters, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Chris.